Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. And after holding a vote for which should be the next Whatifalthist video I react to, more than 100 of you voted in that poll, so thank you very much if you did. And this was the one selected. What if communism never existed? So I was just in a country that was under communist rule for a very long time. I was in Albania this weekend where I went and got this bust here of Skanderbeg. If you don't know who that is, super interesting historical figure. Look it up. I'll probably do a video on it sometime in the near future. But to say that communism had a massive effect on that land is putting it lightly. And before I begin this video, I just want to say on what my initial reaction is. I haven't seen this video before, but what if communism never existed? It would have been something else. By the time 1848 rolls around, the revolutions are happening in Europe. The march towards a sort of social progress, was really unstoppable. And it would have been one of the more social democratic ideologies that would have evolved into something that was more radical, with communism arguably being one of the more radical ideologies. And so I think it's kind of like, yeah, if it hadn't have ever existed, it just would have been something else. The progress ball was rolling. It would have happened in some manner. Anyways, let's see what Whatifalthist thinks about this one. Sorry for the long intro. Let's get into it.
One of the most important movements of modern history.
And every video he has a new mic, I swear.
At a certain point, a third of the human race was controlled by it. And one of the greatest superpowers in history, one that held life and death over billions, was also communist. This entire philosophy was based upon Karl Marx, a downwardly mobile German intellectual of the mid-19th century. This really begs the question, what if communism never existed? How would that affect the rest of history, demographics, culture, wars, and the world today? That's the question of this video.
And let's find out. And it would be really funny if he's sponsored by that Scottish land titles? That's gotta be my favorite one.
Before we start, this alternate history video was sponsored by an alternate history card game.
Go check it out.
Timeline
My thoughts on communism. I'm going to take a shocking guess and say that Whatifalthist is not a fan of communism. Shocking, I know. Let's find out though. This is, surprise of the century.
So let's shoot the elephant in the room. If you watch more than a little of this show, you know I'm a vehement anti-communist. However, I think this bias is entirely justified. I mean, communism killed something in the range of 90 million people in less than 90 years. Nothing else, including capitalism, or all religious and colonial wars combined, gets even close to that number. For a comparison, the Nazis killed somewhere in the range of 12 million. If you want to blame all the deaths in the European theater of World War II on Hitler, you get 40 million deaths, which ties him with Chairman Mao. All the Marxists in the comments are gonna say that wasn't real communism, but that's an argument that can work for any failed ideology. That wasn't real fascism. That wasn't real theocracy. That wasn't real inquisition. Similarly, people say communism failed due to blank variable rather than just throwing out the whole philosophy. However, if we're running an experiment, communism has been tried on basically every variable. There have been upwards of 18 communist nations, existing in every climate, every continent, every civilization. For the people saying Mao and Stalin were bad apples, there have been Marxist states operating on entirely different trajectories, such as Albania or Yugoslavia, and you could throw a dart at the countries that are on their own trajectory in socialism in the third world. If you wanted...
And so here's the other thing too. I think communism and really fascism has just become one of these things that in 2023, right, the only real communist state that really exists is, I don't know, Cuba, North Korea, really. I mean, China's not really communist. They participate in the free market. Whatever, you can argue about this. But this is just one of these things that this argument exists pretty much solely on the internet of people somehow still debating the tenets of communism and not just saying it's a failed experiment. And it's the same thing with like fascism too. Like, I don't know, maybe in your experience it's been different for you, but I've never met someone. I've met like 4 people and they were part of this like Marxist group, and I've talked about them before. But out of the hundreds and hundreds of people that I met during my time in university, 4 of them were like fervent Marxists. You know what I mean? I don't know. I just feel like sometimes this really exists on the internet and not as much in real life. But that's because of the consequences of what happened, where nearly all of the communist states collapsed, barring a very small handful.
perfect experiments, you look at North Korea and East Germany. Both shared the same ethnicity, culture, level of development, rough geographies as their capitalist twins, and both were immeasurably poorer and more politically repressed. If we're going to use Occam's razor, there's really only one answer. If you're a communist, feel free to watch this video and criticize it, but this video is going to be coming from a markedly anti-communist perspective.
Yeah. And again, it's just like, in my overall opinion, and I'm not a student of political science or anything, is that, you know, obviously the enactment has failed. This isn't to say that Das Kapital, right, what Marx originally wrote, it's not to say that his critique of capitalism is incorrect. It isn't, because he put very, very poignant and very well thought out critiques of said system. However, what you do about it, right, I think that, in my opinion, sort of the answer has been found within modern Central and Western Europe of the sort of social democratic systems that these countries have. That's my opinion, right? Purely my opinion. But in a country where I live, like Austria, I believe that the social democratic state really is sort of the what would you say? The centrist sort of solution to what had taken place over the past 100 years or so within Europe. All right. There's my ideology.
I'm also going to make something else clear in this video. This video is not what if the whites won the Russian Civil War. In that timeline, Russia becomes a parliamentary democracy and prevents other countries like China from becoming communist. The gist of the video is that without communism, China modernizes several decades earlier, while Russia becomes an economic juggernaut. The world would currently be in the midst of a three-way Cold War between Russia, America, and China. This video has a lot of overlap with that video, but this video starts earlier, with Karl Marx never being born or becoming an investment banker. Some of you might think that these would end up becoming the same timeline, with the first real big effects of communism being during the Russian Revolution, but I would disagree.
No, it'd be early.
The last 200 years have been an era of massive ideological turmoil. As traditional religions like Christianity went into decline, new ideologies arose to give people purpose and metaphysical understandings of the world. These included things like Nazism, communism, and you could even put modern social justice in the same category.
Oh, come on. Ugh. Okay, I'm glad he wrote that asterisk there of, like, social justice, like, as committed anywhere near, like, come on, man, really? Like, also, what is colonial? And I guess Iberia is ethno-nationalist? This is an odd map, but okay.
And you could even put modern social justice in the same category.
I mean, come on, man.
Communism really spoke to people during industrialization, when traditional village ways of life that existed for millennia suddenly disappeared in the matter of a generation. Similarly, a few became very wealthy while many lived in horrific slums and toiled for 12-hour days.
Yep.
The early stage...
Zero workers' rights. Absolutely none. Even just the most basic thing of safety just did not exist.
Stages of industrialization are often...
Also, look at this map. Isn't this crazy? Ireland still has not gotten back to its pre-famine levels, and that's as of 2023 as well.
Driven by rural population surplus, meaning wages were kept low for factory workers as human labor was cheap. Some new ideology would have shown up to speak to people in these new circumstances. We just have to figure out what it would be. Barring minor variations on communism, I'm guessing it would be Christian socialism. The first monasteries were originally communistic, and Christianity speaks strongly against the search for profit. Communist-like movements in which the leaders pronounced the division of property and sharing everything in common with their followers are innumerably common in the history of Christianity. They've continually popped up with remarkable frequency, normally fizzling out. The most notable example being the early Anabaptists in 16th century Germany. In fact, there's a very interesting theory propounded by the historian Carol Quigley that the right-left divide in the West is based off the divide in Christianity between the traditional Christianity that many of the early church fathers propounded and Augustinianism. The first position holds that man was inherently good and needed gentle guidance. We would all be in heaven if we could learn to share and love. The Augustinian view was pulled originally from Manichaeism and says that mankind is inherently sinful and the world is an endless struggle between the forces of good and evil. Force and discipline are needed to crush evil. This debate has been wrapped up in terms of Hobbes and Rousseau in recent centuries, but has been central to all of Western civilization. Communism is basically dependent upon the
Sure.
first view of humanity, that humanity is basically good and altruistic and sharing will make things better. You might be thinking that the rise of science resulted in the decline of Christianity and other traditional religions, and that's what happened in our world, but I don't think it had to happen, at least not in the time scale it did in our world. Religion was
Nice and nice typo.
remarkably strong before the World Wars. The Western world was actually in a strong religious revival in the 19th century. Christianity, although in a
that's true,
deist
actually.
form, is even strong among intellectuals.
That's a good point. And actually, during the war, during the First World War, there was actually a brief uptick in church going during this period. And so obviously this was a time of a lot of destruction. There was a lot of death, and it wasn't just people, oh, they attended a funeral, they went to a church. No, but this was people doing it during process. Communion, obviously, for the specific Christian religion. But yeah, there was actually a large uptick, and this was something that the Catholic Church was actually quite pleased with during this time. However, the people on the front, whether their sort of belief in a higher power actually, what would you say, got higher or was really destroyed in the face of the destruction that they were living through on the front lines of World War One is a question. But particularly in Britain, by the time the 1920s rolled around, there was that slow decline anyways. I've heard people talk about more recently that sort of like the 1990s is when Christianity started declining, or like the 2000s, but this has been something that's been going on for over a century. So that's something I'm glad he pointed out.
Similarly, in the last century, an era of massive technological progress has also been an era of immense religious growth in areas like Africa, Latin America, the Islamic world, and the American red states. Religion and science can coexist. They just need to figure out parameters by which they can cooperate.
Yeah.
Before World
But again, on the overall though, it is on the decline.
War I, the general idea was that Christianity would control social mores and science would be used for material questions like technology, politics, etc. This view collapsed since A, the world wars were so horrifying that people lost faith in traditional ways, and B, that the worldview offered by Marxism was far more attractive to the intelligentsia. This was because Christianity offered a worldview where humanity would always be subordinate to God, and humanity had to change their actions for God's will. Meanwhile, in the Marxist dialectic of history, the revolution of the working classes and communism would be inevitable, with those leading the charge, namely intellectuals, being the anointed. This is the big reason that academia is so decisively left-wing today, around the world. The secular
I mean, it would also have to do with egalitarian views, right? So generally, the more liberal that you are, the more egalitarian you tend to be. And since Marxism is an arguably, again, let's not get into the weeds here, gentlemen, but an arguably egalitarian ideology, you're more likely to be susceptible to it.
The organization of society was mostly a top-down move. Among European Protestant churches, for example, the move mainly occurred in the 1960s as the clergy became heavily Marxist and started to use the churches for political causes. The congregations
I have no idea if that's true.
were using them mostly for community building simply left. In this timeline without Marxism, intellectuals would stay on the right like they were before World War I.
But they were also, that's tough to say though, because there were also a lot of right-leaning intellectuals, especially in Germany, and in Italy, and in some parts of Eastern Europe as well, particularly Poland, that were more right-leaning during the interwar years as well. But again, not all.
Instead, the vacuum would be filled with Christian socialism, which actually was a fairly large movement in the late 19th century, with groups like the Fabian Club and even H.G. Wells being Christian socialists.
There's an interesting song called, I believe it was, I don't remember the title of it, but it's a cover from Phil Ochs it's originally written by a Scottish Marxist named Ewan MacColl. I believe it's called like Jesus Was a Working Man or something like this, and it's actually a song about how Jesus was a communist, and it's actually really quite good. You should check it out.
In our world, Christian socialism has been a big movement in Latin America and with European politics as well, with the ruling German party today being Christian socialist.
And again, Christian democracy was something that really popped up as sort of this strength in the post-war year, as he said, and that I think he's actually right on the money with this one. This is actually really good. And so the CDU, right, and obviously the SPD as well, although they were in a struggle with the more extreme elements, like such as the KPD, right, the Communist Party of of Germany, there was, sorry, I'm a little bit tired right now. I'm filming this after the flight. There were elements of the SPD as well that were sort of this Christian socialist idea. So this is interesting, actually.
It likely wouldn't be an entirely rainbows and unicorns movement. There was so much dissatisfaction due to the war, and Christianity has a long history of millenarianism and violent outbursts. Imagine, rather than the anarchists of our timeline, Christian socialist fanatics thinking that if they killed blank important figure, who was the Antichrist, the world would be saved. Christianity filling the void would make the Western world more right-wing, sort of similar to how the Islamic world has gone hard right in the last couple decades. Ironically, our timeline's economic right would likely take the position of being the party of secular Enlightenment values. Due to the more conservative values, we might see the
like big L liberal kind of
survival of constitutional monarchies to
a small L liberal
greater extent. Religious societies of higher social cohesion as people are able to form communities of the religious as well as easily get purpose in their lives. Much of the post-1960s boomer trends of children rebelling against their parents, punk goth culture, school shooters, etc. are examples of a post-religious society where there's no clear value system and people are trying to figure out what the value system should be. The side effect of getting a value system would be you can say goodbye to stuff like rock and roll, sweatpants, and sex and violence on TV.
Yeah, okay. I don't know about that one, man. I don't know. Where there's a majority, there's always a minority, right? And I think that these things would still... It's not to say that there would be no rock and roll. I mean, come on. Okay, I kind of see where he's going.
Similarly, the Christian understanding of the world wasn't great to homosexuals or Jews. In another way, it would make the Western world more socially left-wing. This is since a lot of the reasons the communists get so hated is they go against religion, the family, Western civilization, and basically any form of tradition, which gets them hated because most people use those things to base their identity.
Well, would you say that it's really the family, though? I mean... One of the core tenets is that, I guess it's a difference between really... This is the other thing about these reaction videos, man, is like, you're on the spot here, right? So it's kind of hard to think sometimes. But is it really against the family? Because one of the more important rates of this is to have a positive birth rate, right? And so mothers were often rewarded in these communist societies for having large families. So I don't know about that one, but okay.
When couched in conservative terms that would not threaten the general population, all of the Western world would have larger social programs. My guess is that the weaker the peasant culture would be in a country, the less popular Christian socialism would be. This is since in countries like the UK, the indigenous Protestant church has established a capitalist value since the peasants were done away centuries with before. Meanwhile, areas like Germany or France, who were able to maintain a higher degree of peasant culture, would be more popular. It depends a good deal upon culture. For example, the US's interpretation of Christianity is warped into being highly capitalist by the society it lives with, meaning Christian socialism would have little appeal there. The US is also sort of a weird exception, where there's a remarkable degree of internal religious competition, which keeps American Christianity very marketable and vibrant, unlike most areas in Europe where there's a single national church.
Yeah.
The correlation...
Or like in Germany, where you have the Catholic South, Protestant North.
The relation between religion and birth rate is fairly high, meaning a more religious Europe would also have more children. This would mean that Europe would have a more stable birth rate and would thus need less immigration. Similarly, with Europe being significantly more Christian, immigration largely from Islamic countries would be much less popular.
But again, that wasn't immigration though. That was a migrant crisis, and that's okay. Whatever. I'm not going to get into it right now. This video's already getting long enough, but that's like a refugee is not the same as an immigrant, right? So,
if lots of countries question,
and to say that actually that it would be slightly more egalitarian and there would be more social programs, you would think then that actually Christian socialism would have the same amount of immigration, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. If I'm understanding his point here, the immigration actually would be around the same, no?
Questioning the profit motive more, the financial motivation towards technological progress would be less. Technology would a certain degree less advanced. However, the US has invented most things since World War II, and so it wouldn't be by a large degree. Christian socialism would be very popular among the socially conservative but oppressed peasantries in very unequal areas like Latin America and Africa. Expect lots of Christian socialist dictatorships in the Third World. If
Okay.
Christian socialism became very successful, I could see other religions like Buddhism and Hinduism, which have similar socialistic tendencies as Christianity, taking ideas from Christian socialism and incorporating them into their religions. We know very
Sure.
little about how the Christian socialist movement would develop, but it almost certainly would kill less people than communism. Every religious war in history
Man, he's got so many typos. Cbina? Man.
and every religious dictatorship in all of history combined kills less people than just communism.
Again, though, this is the main thing, is that you don't, like, communism, fascism, I mean, nationalism, legal, I don't even know what legalism is, but anyways, like, again, this is really making black and white of four ideologies, four ideologies that couldn't be any more different than each other, right? I wouldn't even consider Japanese nationalism to be an atheist ideology. Yes, okay, they obviously don't believe in God and whatnot, but that's not the central driving tendency for this ideology. Same with fascism, right? Yes, they reject the idea of a deity. However, these are not the central driving tendencies of them. You understand what I'm trying to say here? Is that I get what he's trying to do, but I think it's a slightly unfair argument.
And atheist regimes have consistently killed more people than religious ones. This is since religious regimes have to follow strict moral.
Yeah, so it's good to see, right? Trying to figure out how much a religion is responsible for war is basically impossible to do on my bias for like coloring the stats above. Hey, fair enough. And I'm glad that he admitted that.
Conduct or the state is a
Right, exactly. But for the religions, I tried not to count wars, but for example, the 30 Years' War, yeah, and that's the main thing, right? Didn't do slave trades, right? Yep. Muslim, yep. Spanish conquest of the New World, right? So I don't really think that those totals are really quite fair. And again, it's not as black and white as that is. Oh, if a communist murdered someone, therefore it's atheist death toll raises, you know?
failure. Similarly, religious
In total, and here it says here at the bottom, in total, don't take this seriously.
movements normally put a prime on the human soul and also tend to have conservative views. Keeping things the same as they are requires killing less people than bringing heaven on earth. Similarly, atheist regimes, whether the Qin dynasty, the French revolutionaries, the Nazis, or communists, view the ends as justifying the means, since their goal is to have their finite physical goal be reached and they don't believe in absolute morality.
Sure.
In this timeline, with no communism, there's no Russian Revolution, or there's a millenarian Christian revolution. It really doesn't matter what happens. Either way, the Christians win. This is since if Russia becomes a constitutional monarchy, as it likely would if the whites were to win, the peasants would vote en masse for Christian socialism, an ideology practically designed for them.
True.
The Russian peasants, when they had elections, voted overwhelmingly for socialist candidates and were also very socially conservative.
Yep.
Backwoods Russian orthodoxy also has a strong millenarian streak. This would transform Russia into an effective theocracy. Nazism wouldn't exist in this timeline, at least not in the way it did in our timeline.
Sure.
A huge factor that let the Nazis rise to power was the huge fear on the part of the average German that a communist takeover would destroy German civilization.
Yep.
However, the social...
Especially in the middle classes too, and women as well, actually. That's one of the things that's not often really noted because, I mean, it's pretty deep lore, man, if you start looking into, post-election polls of Nazi Germany, but the middle classes and actually women were one of the larger drivers of the Nazi vote, particularly in 1932.
factors that led to Nazism,
which was the most successful election for the Nazis.
and existing in our timeline would still be there. Similarly, Darwinism posits an interesting rebuttal to the Christian worldview that's so compelling that I can't imagine it not being used.
For sure.
I could see a philosophy...
Wait, when pushed to a logical... When pushed to a logical extreme, Darwinism becomes Nazism? That's a hell of a statement. Okay.
Similarly racist to the Nazis developing, but I don't know how much Christianity would influence this timeline's version of German nationalism.
And that's the thing too. There was actually a sect of German Protestants that believed that sort of this would, like, I'm screwing this up because I'm on the spot here. But I've just recently finished the book on European history from 1900 to 1949 by Ian Kershaw. There was a whole section on the Catholic Church, and it was basically Christian. It was about Christian Nazis and how that they saw that, the church doctrine they practically modified to accept the worldview of National Socialism. And that was, although this was a small sect, there were very, very, very few members of the clergy, and those that did were incredibly brave, that actually spoke out against Nazism, particularly as the crimes of the regime became more and more known.
Anti-Semitism, meanwhile, is nothing new in the history of Christianity. Similarly,
Exactly.
the geographic and geopolitical realities that resulted in World War II in our timeline would likely still be there, meaning we'd likely still see World War II in the following division of Europe between the Russian and Western elements. After
be.
World War II, we could possibly see a greater survival of colonial empires. This was since a big reason for decolonization
that's a good
was that
point.
the Europeans lost
true.
faith in their civilizing mission and that they were superior, and
Yep.
thus had the right to colonize other nations. However, what strongly...
And they were also broke too. And so he actually makes a really great point here. Maybe colonialism would have, hastened in that. Sorry, would have been lengthened in that sense.
Christian European nations, they would still have an ideological reason to maintain colonies, that of Christianization. This timeline honestly gets impossible to predict in fine detail after a certain point, since we don't know how Christian socialism would develop as an ideology. It's like trying to figure out the plot of a drama but barely knowing anything about the main character. I honestly already feel like I'm stretching this timeline too far by going all the way to World War II. Whatifalthist, and thanks for watching.
Cool, yeah, that's an interesting idea. So overall with Christian socialism, the other thing too is that it could take on a more nationalistic tone. Like for example, in somewhere like maybe Poland, it could be more nationalistic, or like Germany. What would somewhere like Italy have, right, with obviously more Catholic presence? These are actually some interesting questions though. So let me know what you think in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed this one. This was way longer than I wanted to talk, but hey, it's a What If Altist video, and they'll probably do the runner-up at some point in the near future, which is how family structure drives ideology, or how ideology drives family structure. One of those two. Anyways, thank you very much for joining me. Take care. All the best. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate the support. Let me know what you think down below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.